Hi, and welcome to this AI and C# video on the Microsoft Agent Framework. And today we have part 2 in our end-to-end sample, where we make the website for the comic book guy from The Simpsons. So last time in part 1 we made a chatbot for him that we can see here. That is not his chatbot, that is his chatbot, where we can talk with him or his assistant, and we can say hi. But we didn't really deploy it, so he came back to us, and he found out that it was not online, so we hadn't shipped it to him. And yeah, I've been busy around the Agent Framework with other stuff, but then we asked him what deployment model would he like. And in true comic books guy style, he wants all of them. So we're gonna deploy this in 6 different ways. We're gonna focus on the back end because the front end is just the front end, and we can host it anywhere you can run HTML because it's WASM, and it's not the interesting part here. The interesting part is the back end. So we're going to deploy it in 6 different ways, some of them fairly similar, some of them very different. And we're going to use Azure as the cloud provider. We'll talk about the other cloud providers a little later. But what we need to, or what we start to do, is we just take an Azure App Service. You can get free tiers on that. They will slow down, and if you don't use it, and you can't use it more than 1 hour a day in compute time, or 60 minutes a day in a compute time. But it's free to do. And if we just make an app service like that with an app service plan in the free tier, we get that, and we of course need to set our variables that we did in app host. So we need to set our 4 variables once it is deployed up here. And I won't go into deployment methods of GitHub Actions versus just pressing publish and so on. That's not the important part of this. This is more, what can AI actually run on? That's the important part here. So we can definitely work on this. But of course, once we now have that we want to run multiple places, I've made a little drop down up here, so we can see right now I'm using the local backend, using the backend we have in Aspire. But if we want to go to that web service backend, we can say, if you like Star Wars, you probably want. So we can ask, and as long as it's warm, it's fairly quick to answer. Actually, sometimes faster than local because it's closer to the AI model. So that just works, but of course we need to do a little refactoring of the code. So in the front end, we had everything in the startup, and we had some services, keyed services to get the agents. We're taking that away because now it's the comic book guy himself who needs to choose case by case what backend he wants. So everything has moved into the home page, and at the top of the home page we have just made a simple select box with the different options. And then whenever we ask, the AI based on what type of backend server, we do the normal thing, but we get the agents directly here instead, based on which of the providers we have chosen. So if we're in local, we hit this one, but in the Windows app that we have deployed. It's the best comic book store ever backend. And we're not buying any domains or anything. We're just using the Azure website. So in order to have the first one, that is what we need to do. Moving on, we can do exactly the same with an app service in Linux. It's exactly the same setup. It's also free, although Microsoft begins to be sneaky that so if you publish from Visual Studio, you actually can't choose the free model anymore. But you can if you make it up in Azure. To me, the Windows version works better. It's faster to spin up. It's faster to restart. It's faster after redeploy. But that's a matter of opinion, of course. But that's what I'm seeing, that this is like twice as slow to start up, and sometimes it fails to deploy. So your opinion if you want to run one or the other. Linux have cheaper free paid tiers than the Windows version. So that could be a thing if you can't run on the free. Of course, in real life, you won't run on the free tier. So that could have some impact on your decision, but they are in general slower. Next up, we have the Azure Container Apps, which is kind of, if you ask a Microsoft employee advocate of .NET, they will say this is the way to do it. I personally don't like containers and Docker and stuff. I feel we are going backwards in terms of software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and so on. And we are going back to taking our own image that could have zero-day issues. It's also not easy to understand because it's a serverless thing that is just consumption. So I cannot tell you how much this costs. It should be fairly low in terms of consumption. But again, you need to run at least the first day before you can see what cost it is. It's also a bit more cumbersome in that the names of the thing you can write cannot have these long names. It cannot have hyphens in them. In some of these things, it's Linux all the way through in that regard. And setting the different variables also needs to happen in two places, one for the secrets and one for the other stuff. But it can be done. I, without any experience ever doing this, I got it up and running fairly quickly. So many people will say this is the right way of doing it. And of course, containers have that benefit of, if you don't want to run it in Azure, you could take your container and move it to another place. It's not like we need to build the container ourselves. This is just a service that we publish our site to as normal. And so far, it's just this switch to choose between the different URLs. So localhost, best comics ever, the Linux version, and the container app puts in a default thing extra, and it's a fairly long URL, if that have any matter to you. So those three are very much the same in terms of, we can just run some .NET, and it just runs an ASP.NET web app. Next up, we have traditional ISS servers. So I installed ISS on my local machine and made a new site called Comic. Because I didn't have it on my machine, I don't normally host anything there. I needed to download the hosting bundle. And once I did that, I needed to go into the web config and set my environment variables on the ASP.NET Core node here. And then it works. Of course, you could have that down in a basement. Comic Book Guy would probably love that, and have it run with your own power and stuff. Probably more expensive in power, to be honest. And you're reliable for the internet connection. So, but it can be done. It's not like AI magically is the same as cloud. Of course, this basement machine would go out, still talk to an LLM, and so on. So traditional old ways can still be done. Then we come to Azure Functions, which is a really good way of having a cheap and scalable model, because the other ones we have seen so far here is running on the free tier, and you very quickly run out of resources for the day if you do that. So for these samples like I'm doing here, it's not a problem. The container apps will not run out, of course, but it quickly will go up in cost. So the cheapest scalable way of running stuff is Azure Functions, because you can run thousands and thousands of requests and still pay nothing, because you get the first amount of million requests for free. So very cheap, especially on the lower tiers. But it has the problem of it can't run AGUI. So if you remember in the part 1, we made AGUI because we wanted to have a website that didn't need to have any credentials at all. So we don't need to have a login page or anything. It was just a public page that could serve the AI chatbot. But Azure Functions can't run AGUI. It's a request response system. It might come at some point, but right now it can't. And then, of course, it's up to your customer, your user. So in Comic Book Guy, if it's a must, then we need to say Azure Functions is not an option. We need to go something that can run ASP.NET Core Web API. If we want to be flexible or want to allow that we're not using AGUI, it can be done. So in the code, I made 2 backends now. So I have the traditional one here, which I haven't changed too much, and the backend. I didn't need to change the backend here, but just because I have 2 web backends now, I made a shared class library where I put down to get the configurations out, because both of them can do it in the same manner. And I got the agent part out, so I don't need to duplicate myself. So this was not needed, other than I didn't want duplication. In the app host, we of course registered the Azure app, and we made it dependent on the variables we need. Beyond that, the Azure Function backend is just, in our case, a single function. And what we do is we ask for a request where we can get a request if it's the Comic Buy or the assistant being asked, and what the question is. So we simply deserialize that, and based on that, we choose which agent we want to use. And then we do a normal run async, because we can't really stream anything right now, and we're just throwing the text back raw. We could have given it back in a more structured format that the client could then use. And on the client side, we need to now go in and say, when we ask the AI if it's Azure, either local or deployed, we don't do AGUI. So we instead make a request and do a simple request response using HTTP client, like you would with any API. And doing it like this, of course, is secure now because someone could go and begin to spam our Azure function, of course. But that is not our intent here. It's to have a public site without any credentials up here. So we could do it if we don't support ADUI, and if we do support ADUI, it is just the normal way of doing it in the past here. So what we see is that the Azure function is just a little like the others. It has a function app, an app service plan, and a storage. And in there we also need to set the app settings. What we do need as well is to set CORS in the regular backend. We could set it in code, but in Azure Functions we set it in the portal, where we go up and say that in CORS should allow the various different origins. And you might say, okay, then it can only use that local host or that place we do it. Remember that CORS is only something JavaScript is all about. If you have a desktop app that try to call this, it would not need CORS. So it's not a security measure, CORS, other than cross-site scripting. So Azure Functions is definitely possible, but not together with ADUI. Then there's a few things I haven't tried because it's simply too big of a setup to do, but I can't imagine they wouldn't work. There's Azure App Services as containers, so where we give it a Docker image. So it works more or less like the app service, but with us giving the image instead of the ones Microsoft have in Windows and Linux. Then there's Azure Container Registry, where we control the Docker images in a much more advanced way. And if you want to go real old school, you can go with Azure Virtual Machines, where you control it, and then it will essentially become the web server ISS, but in the cloud or the equivalent in a Linux machine. There's also Docker Container Registry in general for other places to do Docker. And of course, the price will vary based on how big a virtual machine you buy, what you set up. But all of these should be possible to do as well. Then there's 3 that are not possible to use in our scenario. Microsoft Foundry, where you make your agents and host them up there, cannot do ADUI, so it's not really a candidate to do any of this. We could technically talk with Foundry and the agents, but it would just be similar to talking to the LLM directly, which we could have done in Blazor WASM, but we would expose our API keys. So in my book, it's not a doable thing. And in the same way, we could have had an Azure function as a proxy between it, but then we would just make one extra jump. So it would be front end to Azure function to Microsoft Foundry to the LLM instead of just front end Azure function LLM. So this is out of the question. Perhaps they at some point make a checkbox that says expose as ADUI, and then it would be a really, really nice way of doing things. But right now, that's not possible. And then there's the various static app pages. So I've taken the Azure static apps and the GitHub pages, which are the 2 most common. But given that they can't run .NET at all, they are not an option. They are really good candidates to put the front end in, but not the back end. Other cloud providers, of course, they can do it. As we can see, it's just about if you can run the .NET workload, you can host an AI like this. If not, you can't. So this was a bit of a long one, but again, now Comic Book Guy have 6 different ways of hosting his website. He probably will choose one of them, and that will be where we continue in the series of adding more features and leave the others to the wayside. But let him decide, and we will see in the next one. So see you there.